The public narrative surrounding Joan Jett often suffers from oversimplification, reducing her existence to a series of leather-clad aesthetics and three-chord anthems. To truly understand her trajectory, one must look beyond the surface-level rebellion and analyze the structural hostility she encountered during her formative years. This is not merely a story about wanting to be a musician. It is a clinical look at an industry architecturally designed to exclude women. Long before she stepped into the spotlight, Jett was forced to confront the harsh reality that her ambition existed in a vacuum where no path had been paved for her. The suburbia of Pennsylvania in the 1970s was a landscape defined by rigid gender roles and conservative expectations. For a young girl named Joan Larkin, the dream of rock stardom was not just a hobby, it was an act of defiance against the very foundation of her community. When she received her first guitar, she did not encounter mentorship, she encountered a barrier. The dismissal she faced at 13, the cold, instructional assertion that girls simply did not play rock, is a defining trauma of her professional life. This moment serves as a microcosm for the decade of pushback she would soon endure, acting as the primary catalyst for her hardened, independent creative spirit. Refusing to be shaped by external standards, she began a process of self-teaching that would become her signature. By rejecting the traditional route of formal instruction, she implicitly rejected the rules of the industry before she even understood how they functioned. This early autonomy was a survival mechanism. She didn't want to be polished or refined for the male gaze. She wanted the raw, visceral sound that resonated in her own mind. This choice to remain unrefined is precisely what allowed her to develop a unique guitar style, one rooted in instinct rather than academic discipline, which would later define the sound of an entire generation of punk and rock musicians. The migration of her family to California was not just a change of scenery, it was a strategic entry into the epicenter of the music world. However, the Sunset Strip was not a welcoming environment for an aspiring female rocker. During this time, the disconnect between her passion and her ability to participate was immense. Watching from the shadows of clubs like the English disco, she was a silent observer in a world that refused to grant her a voice. This period of exclusionary observation was critical, as it allowed her to identify the theatricality of glam rock and the possibilities of gender-bending performance without the interference of industry handlers. It was during these formative years that she found in Suzi Quatro the validation she so desperately lacked. Quatro was more than a role model, she was a strategic proof of concept. Seeing a woman command a stage with a guitar provided the mental blueprint Jett needed to proceed. The transition from Larkin to Jett was not a fleeting choice, it was a rebranding of her own existence. She began to craft an identity that prioritized sharpness, strength, and an almost abrasive lack of sentimentality. This was the birth of the persona that would eventually withstand decades of industry-wide erasure. The formation of the Runaways is frequently romanticized as a girl power movement, but an analytical look reveals a darker, more predatory reality. At 16, Jett was placed into a system managed by Kim Fowley, a figure who leveraged her youth and gender as commodities rather than artistic assets. The environment was essentially a laboratory for controversy. By forcing these young women into a hypersexualized framework, the industry stripped away their agency, turning their performances into a spectacle for critics to pick apart. This era was less about musical development and more about navigating an environment of exploitation. The media coverage of the Runaways serves as a perfect case study for the misogyny of the 1970s music press. Rarely did articles focus on their chord structures or their songwriting abilities. Instead, the lexicon was dominated by words that questioned their legitimacy: wild, juvenile, and sham. This linguistic marginalization was a deliberate effort to minimize the threat they posed to the male-dominated status quo. Jett was learning in real time that the more talented she became, the more aggressively the industry would attempt to frame her as an anomaly or a passing fad, rather than a serious contributor. What remains under-discussed in the history of the band is the physical toll the rejection took on them. The act of performing, standing on a stage, playing an instrument, and being met with open hostility or worse, being spit upon, would be enough to force most individuals into early retirement. That Jett endured this is a testament to an internal fortitude that few artists ever have to develop. She wasn't just fighting for her place in a band, she was fighting to define what a woman was allowed to do in a public space. This period of extreme pressure effectively forged her into the icon she became. Even when they found success in Japan, it was a hollow victory that highlighted the disconnect between their talent and their reception at home. The Beatlemania level of success overseas proved that they were commercially viable, but it didn't solve the structural problem of their management. Internally, the band was becoming an unsustainable pressure cooker. As the facade of unity crumbled, the young members were left to deal with the psychological fallout of having their youth consumed by a system that never intended for them to have long-term success. The eventual dissolution of the Runaways wasn't a sudden ending, it was a slow, agonizing process of disillusionment. For Jett, this was a point of crisis. The failure of the band was not her personal failure, yet it was being framed that way by the industry. She had invested everything into a vision that was hijacked by others' ambitions and exploitative agendas. The anger that emerged from this period was not destructive. It was, in retrospect, the engine that would drive her to build her own kingdom from the wreckage. The period immediately following the band's collapse is the most misunderstood chapter of her life. Rather than finding a new group or auditioning for others, she descended into a period of deep professional isolation. The coping mechanisms she adopted, the heavy drinking and the quiet resentment, were direct reactions to being erased. She had worked harder than her male peers, yet she was starting from zero. This internal darkness was not a sign of weakness. It was the inevitable result of a system that tried to break her spirit through institutionalized rejection. The 23 label rejection story is often cited as a cliché, but its statistical significance is staggering. In any other field, 23 consecutive professional rejections would be a career-ending statistic. That she persisted indicates a level of psychological detachment from the industry's opinion of her. She stopped asking for entry and started building the gate. By choosing to release her own music, she bypassed the gatekeepers entirely, a move that was, at the time, considered financial suicide. It was the moment she transitioned from a musician to an independent business owner. Founding Blackheart Records was the definitive statement of her career. It was a move born of necessity, funded by money that wasn't meant for rock and roll, but it resulted in a level of artistic freedom that no contract could have provided. By selling records out of her car, she created a direct, unmediated connection with her audience. This wasn't just selling music, it was reclaiming the power structure of the industry. She was no longer a product of an label, she was the architect of her own distribution. The success of I Love Rock and Roll is often viewed as a triumph in the traditional sense, but for Jett it was a moment of deep existential validation. She had achieved the #1 spot on her own terms without changing her sound or her look to accommodate executive whims. However, the victory was bittersweet. The same industry that had shut its doors on her was now claiming her as a success story. Her skepticism of that success was not cynical, it was earned. She understood that if the industry could make her, they could just as easily break her. The decision to move forward with an all-male backing band, the Blackhearts, is frequently analyzed as a practical choice, but its emotional weight is often overlooked. After the exploitative experience of the Runaways, she needed a buffer. She needed to remove the all-female tag that the media used to categorize her as a novelty. By surrounding herself with men, she forced the focus back onto the music itself. It was a tactical, calculated move to strip away the industry's ability to dismiss her as a gimmick. Throughout the peak of her fame, the obsession with her sexuality was another tool of marginalization. By demanding a label, the media was attempting to simplify her, to put her into a box they could understand and navigate. Her refusal to comply was not an act of secrecy, it was an act of boundary setting. She recognized that the moment she gave the public what they wanted, she would lose her autonomy. She chose to be perceived as all-inclusive because that was the only definition that allowed her to remain entirely herself. The relentless touring schedule that followed her massive hits was not just about maintaining visibility, it was about survival. She understood the fleeting nature of rock fame, especially for a woman. She stayed on the road, playing smaller venues and keeping her craft sharp. This wasn't the behavior of a superstar looking to cash out. It was the behavior of a professional who knew that the only real security in the music industry is the loyalty of your audience and the quality of your live performance. Critics who dismissed her later work failed to understand that she was no longer performing for them. She was performing for the legacy she had spent years constructing. The periods of low commercial success were not failures, they were consistent, dedicated years of artistic continuity. She had already survived the worst the industry could offer. A few poor chart performances were insignificant in comparison. Her longevity became the ultimate middle finger to those who predicted she would be a one-hit wonder. When allegations against Kim Fowley finally became public, her response was characteristically measured. She didn't use the revelations to paint herself as a victim. Instead, she maintained a firm professional boundary. She didn't need to leverage the trauma of her youth to garner public sympathy. She had already moved past that chapter, and she didn't want the defining narrative of her later years to be about someone else's failures. She chose to be defined by her own work, not her own suffering. Ultimately, Joan Jett's legacy is not just about the songs. It is about the structural shift she forced in the industry. She proved that you could be a woman in rock, be completely uncompromising, and still achieve global long-term success. She became the godmother of punk not by being a symbol but by being an anomaly that refused to go away. She changed the math of the music business, showing that the only way to beat a broken system is to build one that functions on your own terms. The silence that followed her rise to fame is often misinterpreted as a guarded secret. In reality, it was a professional necessity. Joan Jett's career was built in an environment where even the smallest deviation from the expected pop star path was met with severe scrutiny. Analyzing her silence reveals not a woman hiding from her history, but a woman who recognized that in the court of public opinion, a woman's personal life is frequently used as a weapon to undermine her professional accomplishments. Her quietness was a defensive strategy against an industry that fed on scandal. To understand her choices, one must analyze the difference between public truth and private truth. Publicly, Jett became an icon of rebellion, a brand that stood for rock and roll purity. Privately, she was managing the residual trauma of a system that had tried to commodify her. This divide was intentional. By keeping her personal life separate from her public persona, she ensured that the brand Joan Jett remained untouchable. She wasn't just managing her image, she was protecting her soul from the invasive, hungry nature of tabloid media. The critique of her as difficult or uncooperative during interviews was always rooted in this need for autonomy. Journalists wanted access to her pain. They wanted her to confirm or deny the rumors of the Runaways or her own sexuality. Her refusal to engage with those questions wasn't a rejection of her fans, but a rejection of the voyeuristic nature of celebrity journalism. She recognized that the moment she gave the media a story, she would become a character in someone else's drama. She refused to participate in the dismantling of her own legacy. Consider the physical reality of the life she chose. Touring in the 1980s and 90s was a grueling process that required immense stamina and mental fortitude. When her peers were settling into the luxury of success, Jett remained in the trenches, playing club dates and festival circuits. This wasn't because she had to, it was because she loved the work. Her relationship with her audience was the only thing that had never been mediated by a label or a producer. That connection was the only currency she truly valued. Her songwriting process also reflects this survival instinct. I Love Rock and Roll is a masterpiece of simplicity, but its power lies in its universality. It is a song that doesn't need to explain itself. Its songwriting style is stripped back, devoid of the unnecessary flourishes that often clutter rock music. This mirrors her personality, efficient, direct, and unpretentious. She writes the music she wants to hear, which, as it turns out, is the same music millions of others want to hear too. The industry's reaction to her in the late 80s and early 90s provides an interesting case study in market manipulation. As grunge began to emerge, the industry suddenly found authenticity to be a profitable commodity. Jett was suddenly rediscovered as a pioneer, yet many of the new stars were merely imitating the path she had blazed a decade prior. She navigated this with a level of grace that is rarely noted. She didn't claim credit, she didn't demand recognition. She just kept playing. The shift toward corporate sponsorships and brand-heavy marketing in the 2000s also bypassed her. While many artists signed away their legacies for endorsement deals, Jett remained focused on her own output. This is not to say she was anti-business. She was a brilliant businesswoman. However, her business model remained rooted in the direct-to-fan, label-independent structure she had pioneered decades before. She understood that if you own your masters, you own your future. What about the Riot GRRRL movement? Jett was often cited as a spiritual ancestor by bands like Bikini Kill and Sleater-Kinney. While she was undoubtedly a catalyst for their movement, she never sought to lead it. This is a critical distinction. A lesser artist would have co-opted the movement to boost their own brand. Jett allowed it to be theirs. She recognized that her role was to be the proof of possibility, not the gatekeeper of the next generation. That lack of ego is what cemented her as an icon. The way she handled aging in the industry is perhaps her most impressive feat. The rock industry is notoriously unkind to women as they age. Most are forced to either pivot into soft, adult contemporary music or fade into obscurity. Jett stayed in the lane she built. She never changed her look, never softened her sound to appeal to a mature audience, and never apologized for still being a rock and roll force. She proved that rebellion isn't a phase, it's a permanent state of being. Her induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was the final, inevitable closing of the circle. While many viewed it as long overdue, Jett viewed it as a confirmation of the work. She didn't seem surprised or overly emotional. She walked onto that stage with the same intensity she had in 1976. The Hall of Fame for her was just another stage. The recognition was nice, but it didn't change the work. The work was always the point. The psychological resilience required to sustain this level of influence is rarely discussed. We often think of rock icons as people who had everything handed to them. Jett had nothing handed to her. Every milestone, every hit, every tour, every award was a result of a cold, calculated strategy to survive. Her story is a blueprint for anyone who has been told they don't belong in a space but refuses to leave. Her relationship with her fans is another pillar of her longevity. She has always been accessible in a way that feels genuine, never manufactured for a press cycle. She treats her audience as peers, not subjects. This creates a feedback loop of loyalty that has kept her relevant long after her contemporaries have been forgotten. It's an organic growth model that is now being taught in business schools as the direct-to-consumer gold standard. Critics who once dismissed her have had to recalibrate their entire framework to account for her endurance. You cannot call someone a flash in the pan when they have been delivering hits for 50 years. This forced the music industry to reevaluate how it defines success. Jett proved that the market is not the final arbiter of value, the fan is. That shift in power is her most significant, if least acknowledged, contribution to modern music. The evolution of her sound, subtle as it has been, shows a deep understanding of her own instrument. She doesn't need to play faster or louder than the young bands she tours with, she just needs to play with more intention. Her guitar work is a masterclass in economy. She knows exactly which note to hit to trigger the most visceral reaction. This is the mark of a master who has spent a lifetime studying the mechanics of sound. What would have happened if she had given up after the 23 rejections? It's a compelling thought experiment. The music landscape would look fundamentally different. The all-female rock band would still be treated as an anomaly. The blueprint for independent label ownership would have remained largely theoretical. She didn't just save her own career, she saved the space for everyone who came after her. She is the ultimate example of the self-made archetype in music. She didn't need the validation of executives, the praise of critics, or the approval of the mainstream. She defined her own reality and forced the world to eventually catch up. This is not just a rock story, it's a case study in power, autonomy, and the refusal to be silent in the face of institutionalized erasure. Her voice even now hasn't changed. It is still the same sharp, raspy, honest voice that defined her early years. It carries the history of every club she played, every insult she ignored, and every song she wrote to survive. It is a voice that has been tempered by fire and emerged stronger. It is the voice of someone who has seen it all and decided that none of it was worth changing who she is. The lie that started everything, the idea that girls couldn't play rock, was the best thing that ever happened to her. It provided the friction she needed to ignite her career. Without that rejection, she might have been a comfortable, conventional musician. Instead, she became a force of nature. That is the irony of her life. The people who tried to stop her are the exact reason she succeeded. We live in a culture that is obsessed with secrets. We want to know the hidden truth, the dark past, the private struggles. Jett's brilliance lies in her realization that there is no secret. Everything you need to know about her is in the music. She poured everything she had into her songs, leaving nothing behind. She gave the world her music and kept herself for herself. That is not a secret, that is a superpower. So when we look back at her legacy, we shouldn't ask what she was hiding. We should ask how she managed to stand so tall in a world that wanted her to bow. Her silence wasn't a mask, it was a wall. A wall she built to protect the one thing that mattered most, her integrity, and in the end, that is the only thing that lasts. To finalize our analysis, we must move into the philosophical implications of Joan Jett's career. Her existence in the public eye is a study in unapologetic presence. Most celebrities spend their entire careers apologizing for their past, for their behavior, for their aging, or for their failures. Jett has never uttered an apology. This is not stubbornness, it is a profound philosophical position. She recognizes that to apologize for one's journey is to admit that the journey was wrong. She believes in her journey, and that belief is absolute. This philosophical stance has profound implications for how we view artistic success. We are taught that success is a linear path: education, audition, contract, fame. Jett's career is a chaotic, nonlinear progression that defies these conventions. She teaches us that success is not a destination provided by the industry. It is a territory you must conquer, inhabit, and defend. This is the Jett doctrine. If the world doesn't give you a seat at the table, you don't ask for one, you take the table. Consider the role of the guitar in her philosophy. For her, the instrument is not an accessory, it is a tool of agency. Every time she straps on a guitar, she is reclaiming the moment she was told she couldn't. It is a ritual of power. This is why she never stopped playing. To stop would be to cede the power she spent her life earning. The guitar is her shield, her sword, and her identity. Her impact on the language of rock is also deep, yet underanalyzed. She introduced a vocabulary of defiance that did not exist before. Phrases like "I don't give a damn about my bad reputation" are not just lyrics, they are survival manifestos. They speak to the experience of being an outsider, of being judged by a society that doesn't understand your ambition. She gave her fans a language to defend their own existence. This language is rooted in a fundamental honesty that is rare in the music industry. She doesn't write songs about fantasy or luxury, she writes about the visceral realities of human experience: desire, rejection, anger, and joy. This is why her music never ages. The emotions she describes are not tied to a specific decade, they are the fundamental building blocks of the human condition. She writes songs that are as relevant to a 15-year-old in 2026 as they were in 1981. Her business philosophy is equally important. By running Blackheart Records with such precision, she challenged the myth that artists are bad with business. She proved that an artist can maintain total control over their creative output while building a sustainable, profitable empire. She is the blueprint for the modern independent artist who leverages streaming, social media, and digital distribution to maintain independence. But it's the Riot Girl influence that really shows her reach. By being the first to break the barrier, she essentially made it possible for an entire generation of women to consider rock as a viable career path. She didn't do this through speeches or activism, she did it through performance. She was the proof of possibility, and that in the end is the most powerful form of activism, the simple act of showing up and succeeding where you were told you couldn't. Looking at her life through an analytical lens also helps us understand the nature of fame versus legacy. Fame is the temporary state of being recognized by the masses. Legacy is the long-term impact on the culture. Jett's fame has fluctuated as all fame does, but her legacy has only grown. She is now recognized as a foundational figure in rock, not because the industry finally caught up, but because her influence has been undeniable for decades. This is the central lesson of her story. Consistency is more powerful than intensity. A career of 50 years of consistent, uncompromising work will always outperform a decade of explosive, fame-driven success. She built her house on rock, not on sand. That is why she is still here while so many of her peers have disappeared. Her foundation was forged in the fire of rejection, and nothing in the industry has been able to shake it. We must also talk about the gendered criticism she faced. Even now, some critics try to frame her career as a woman's success in a man's world. This is a condescending framing. She is a musician's success. Her gender is a fact of her existence, but it is not the explanation of her success. To focus on it is to minimize the sheer, raw talent and grit it took to achieve what she did. She didn't succeed despite being a woman. She succeeded because she was Jett. Her influence on the visual language of punk is also significant. The leather jacket, the dark eyeliner, the messy hair, she created a look that is now the global shorthand for rock star. But she didn't choose it because it was cool, she chose it because it was her armor. It was a visual barrier she erected between her true self and the public. She turned her identity into an icon, and in doing so she became the template for everyone who followed. Why do people continue to ask about her sexuality, even after 50 years? Because they are uncomfortable with ambiguity. They want to categorize her, to place her in a box they can understand. Her refusal to comply is an act of intellectual rebellion. She recognizes that our obsession with labels is a way of maintaining control. By remaining all-inclusive, she denies the world that control, forcing them to engage with her as a person rather than a category. This is the core of her philosophy, the absolute right to be uncategorized. She is an artist, a business owner, a pioneer, and an icon. But more than that, she is a person who has made the conscious choice to be herself, regardless of what the world demands. That is the most radical thing a woman can do in a patriarchal society. She hasn't just survived, she has thrived on her own terms. The silence we keep talking about, it's actually a form of eloquence. She says everything she needs to say through her music. Why does she need to explain her life to an interviewer? She has already written the soundtrack to her life. Every song is a confession, every performance is a testament. She isn't withholding information, she is simply choosing a more powerful medium to communicate it. What will her legacy look like in another 50 years? I suspect her music will still be played in clubs, in bedrooms, and in stadiums. The story of her life will be taught not just as a music biography, but as a case study in resilience. She will be remembered as the woman who broke the machine from the inside, not by changing the rules, but by demonstrating that the rules never really applied to her in the first place. This is the ultimate takeaway from an analytical documentary on Joan Jett. She is the definitive proof that integrity is the only sustainable strategy for a long-term career. Every choice she made, from founding her own label to refusing to fit into a neat media narrative, was a move toward protecting her integrity. And that integrity is the reason she is a legend today. The lie that began her life, the rejection that set the course for her entire career, wasn't just a hurdle. It was the training that allowed her to become a master of her own destiny. Without the resistance, she never would have developed the strength to build the empire she now oversees. She didn't overcome the odds, she changed the odds by refusing to play by them. In conclusion, Joan Jett's story is not a tragedy of a girl who was rejected by a mean world. It is the victory of a woman who identified the limitations of her environment and decided, quite simply, to ignore them. She built a life, a career, and a legacy that will outlast all of us. She is the living, breathing evidence that the only limits that truly exist are the ones we accept for ourselves. So the next time you hear one of her songs, don't just hear the melody. Hear the defiance, the persistence, and the raw, uncompromising integrity of a woman who never asked for permission. She didn't need it then, and she doesn't need it now. She is Joan Jett, and she is the master of her own sound. That is the real story. And it's a story that will be told as long as people value the truth over the hype. Her silence was never a sign of weakness or a need for protection. It was the clearest, most articulate expression of her power. She didn't have to explain her survival because the fact that she was still standing on that stage was the only proof anyone needed. She is the monument to her own existence, a testament to the idea that if you stand your ground, the world eventually has to move for you. She is and always will be the godmother of the unapologetic.